You'll need to restart it. There you go.
All right, this is awesome. Okay, so welcome to the Community Book Club. In this year, or today, this month for June, we're focusing on our poet that is our special keynote speaker for our Sunday event during Quills, which is hosted by the League of Utah Writers. My name is Candace Thomas. I am a local poet and I am a fantasy author. I'm also the marketing chair for the League of Utah Writers. And I am very pleased to talk to Willy Palomo today, who is, well, I'll read his bio in just a minute, but we will be discussing his poetry work that is called 8 Omens Before the Destruction of the Empire. Is that correct, Willy?
Right.
Okay, cool. So I'm just going to, I need to pull up. I made myself some notes so I wouldn't forget some things. Okay, so before we actually start discussing, I just want to kind of go over why we do this community book club. We started this, the League of Utah Writers started this to try to promote more work that is engaging and very that promotes a discussion, and we felt that this work would really be excellent to talk about this month. The League of Utah Writers, if you don't know, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to offering friendship, education, and encouragement to the writers and poets of Utah. Our organization aids our members in the improvement of their craft and support their goals. Willy is the son of 2 immigrants from El Salvador. In 2018, he graduated with an MA in Latin American and Caribbean Studies and an MFA in Poetry from Indiana University. In 2017, he received the City of Bloomington Latino Leadership Award and the Martin Luther King Building Bridges Graduate Student Award. So sounds like a huge honor for his work serving undocumented communities in Indiana. He has taught literature, creative writing, and the Poetics of Rap in university, juvenile detention centers, community centers, and high schools. He has performed his poetry nationally and internationally. He is the founding member of, let me make sure I say this right, Plumas Colectiva?
Yeah.
All right, oh, good. And a literary and art collective in the Latinx creators it says in the 801, so here in Utah. And he is the director of the Utah Humanities Book Festival. So thank you, Willy, so much for coming and for being part of this. First of all, before I really dive into this, I want to know a little bit more about you as a poet, what kind of background you had, what kind of inspiration you had that you gravitated to poetry specifically.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Candace, and with the League of Utah Writers. My poetry genesis story is essentially really rooted in hip hop. So my brother was a particularly strange child in that he gravitated very heavily to music at a young age. By the time I was in 3rd, 4th grade, so 9-ish, I was listening to hip hop albums that were a little bit heavier, things like Stillmatic by Nasir Jones. So very young, I had kind of a lot of music coming in that was hip hop oriented, and my brother was a DJ. So I was one of those kids that picked up poetry largely through the art of rap. And like I would write my little remix verses. I grew up in the age of the remix where P. Diddy was dropping a remix every other like Sunday. That was one of the first little hip hop albums I had was P. Diddy's We Invented the Remix. And that's kind of how I got a foot into the door with poetry. But that said, that very quickly kind of expanded to a lot of other avenues, even by middle school. By middle school, I was like enjoying Langston Hughes, always a book nerd. That was me growing up. And we stumbled upon Def Jam poetry, which was born out of which had poets from a wide variety of traditions, from the spoken word, from the Nuyorican to more African American traditions to what's considered traditional poetry slam. And then essentially what happened was that I was kind of gearing up to be a rapper with my brother. And then when I was a sophomore in high school, he went on an LDS mission. So I lost my DJ. And then I discovered the poetry slam scene in Utah through poets like D. Emmett and Cody Winger, and really just became enamored with the art form. But I think what was most important was that poetry slam gave me a community. So it gave me a place where I can like go to open mics, test out work, compete against folks, be rewarded. And one of the most, I think, important things for a young writer is getting feedback from a real live audience and stuff like that. And my maturity in writing, I feel like, accelerated because of that. Yes, because slam audiences won't be nice to you just because you're young. They'll go ahead and I was performing at Moe's Bar and Grill at the time, which was I was barely old enough to get in, and there's just a bunch of drunk people around you, and yeah, they won't be nice to you if they don't like your poems. At the same time, because I was kind of a book nerd, heavily steeped in the LDS church, especially during my early adolescence. I also feel like the kind of twin parents my poetry has is one is the hip hop tradition, the spoken word that is adjacent to it. The other one is kind of like scripture. I learned close reading at the earliest age, I would say, through seminary, the release time that you get when you're a high school Mormon kid in Utah, where you would go, essentially skip out on school for a bit to go take a church class where you focus on one of the canonical texts. And for me, that was a place where I was diving very deeply in, partially because I was troubled, and religion kind of thrives off sometimes people who are looking for God and looking for answers and stuff like that. And they were folks who taught me how to do close reading, and the close reading I was doing, I was very invested in, just because, especially when it's scripture, the meaning of life kind of hinges on that. So there's kind of that heaviness that's mixed into a lot of the work that I do as well. But since I was a book nerd, I was constantly coming at things trying to kind of shoulder both traditions, and I think that that's something I carried on early on. I think one of the most important things for young poets especially to do is to be able to contextualize their work based in the traditions that they're drawing from. T.S. Eliot has a whole essay about this that I'm forgetting the name of right now, but that's less important. So essentially, I very much in my undergrad days saw myself as somebody who on my left shoulder had the hip hop tradition, the spoken word traditions I was coming from, and on my right shoulder had T.S. Eliot and Pablo Neruda and some of these other poets I was trying to make sense of in my head. But yeah, I mean, poetry slam is one of those things that I was leaving the LDS church, growing in all the ways young people are growing when they transition from high school to undergrad, and self-discovery. And poetry slam kind of became the lifestyle I was in, where I was attending events, recruiting poets, building teams of poets, and just trying to really get a handle on the craft. And then that eventually led me to an MFA, where, as any solid MFA would do, you just read a whole bunch more. So while there's definitely the genesis, I'd say, of especially my public work being in poetry slam, like most poets who emerge from poetry slam. It's just like one element of the things that we do. So that's something that I think is important to me, especially now as I grow more. Before, I like very much liked being like, no, I identify as a slam poet. I particularly want to like build distance between me and poets who don't know how to perform. That's the way I would view it when I was young. um but now it's more of like, no, there's like, a whole tree of literature that I've kind of grown from, that I see myself as being a part of and attempting to contribute to. So I guess that's my little poet genesis story, if we wanted to share one briefly.
No, that's beautiful. I did pick up on a few things that I found interesting. Specifically, is Langston Hughes one of your specific role models when it comes to poetry?
It would be very generous of me to say that about myself, where I'd be like, oh, Langston Hughes, I have he was one of the first books of poetry I read in 8th grade, where I read through one of his like collected works, like front to back, and kind of obsessed about it. But again, that was like 8th grade, right? I memorized the poem like I Too Sing America. Um, um, by him when I was in 8th grade, and that was influential there. And like, don't get me wrong, I love many Langston Hughes poems. That said, I haven't done a serious deep dive in his work since like high school. So like, that's something that like, that's something I should be ashamed of, and like I'll own up to that. But like, yes, I do see Langston as being a part of the tradition I'm drawing from, and like, yeah, it's funny how books can have such a monumental impact on you, even when your relationship to them might be like, a fraction of the time you spent like doing your literary life.
I bring that up because I find it interesting that I just finished like a poetry class where I studied Langston Hughes, and I had to do this big like essay on that, and I chose I Too Sing America, that one that you just mentioned. So I think that's kind of, I don't know, pretty special. So I want to talk about your what we're talking about here is your 8 omens. So tell me first how this came about, and I put links to anyone for specifically this work and to your website as well in the chat. But if you, just tell me a little bit more about this specific work.
Yeah, so
It's very,
essentially, go for it.
it's, I find the whole thing, the whole package very fascinating. The subject matter, how the poem is kind of brought, it's like very visual. So just tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, so essentially, sometime in undergrad or early grad school, I can't remember quite when I encountered the book. I encountered Broken Spears, the a book that was edited by Miguel Leon Portilla, that describes itself as telling the native side of the story of the Spanish conquest. I think the storyline that like stereotypically gets set in US classrooms, or at least what I was taught, was like Cortez came through, explored Mexico and that region for a bit, and then with a group of like, maybe 12 to 30 or whatever men, was able to take down the capital. The story is, of course, a lot more complicated than that. And as yes, a part of my own personal like research and trying to understand Latin American history and what that meant for me, and like my relationship to El Salvador and things like that. I was invested in doing a lot of the research and trying to understand what was essentially racial politics in Latin America in particular. I think I spent a lot of my undergrad wrestling with gender and wrestling with racial politics in the United States. But the thing is that racial politics in the US versus the rest of like the Americas is vastly different, and would change from country to country. So being able to like, these experiences I was having of going back to like my parents' homeland of El Salvador, and like trying to navigate that space and trying to make sense of like my own identity in that space, led me to doing more research. So I pick up this book, and one of the first things that has in it is like these 8 omens that the Mexica, the Aztecs experience like before Christopher Columbus, before the Cortez. I apologize for keep making that mistake. Before Cortez even kind of arrives and starts conquering, right? And all these things are like supernatural, right? So they're very kind of jarring for me, like to be like, oh wow, this is like the written history. And like historians look at it and they're like, yeah, Christians were a supernatural believing people. The indigenous folks of the time were a supernatural believing people. So as far as we understand, these things actually happened, and these are the ways that they were interpreted by the people on the ground. So you get things like, you know, this pyramid of fire in the sky, temples being burnt down and things like that. Very dramatic. But the one that caught my eye the most was the last omen, which is essentially this zombie figure that has 2 heads that emerges and that terrifies like the, city of Tecnotitlan, where there's like this 2-headed monster kind of walking around. And the reason that one struck me the most is because the metaphor is like so obvious. It's like hitting you over the head, where it's like, yeah, part of the consequence of what would happen once like, Europeans start arriving to the Americas and colonizing and things like that, is that the 2 cultures would mix, right? And that they'd create kind of this 2-headed monster. It was in that way like a very apt omen. So like I actually wrote the last poem in the series first, where I was just kind of moved by that image of like, oh wow, it's this 2-headed creature. And like that is what it means to a certain extent to be a mestizo. So that's what drew me to it at first. And then it just kept haunting me, just because it's like something that we don't, I think, in our contemporary language have room to explain, like, oh, this was just history for these folks, like all these supernatural occurrences. And if you're trying to make sense in it in our own like modern context, there's that tendency to look at them and be like, oh, what ignorant, like, people that used to live back then didn't have a scientific or astronomical explanation for what was happening. When of course, that's a very kind of snooty and like, condescending way to look down on like, very intelligent like nations. Like the Aztecs, the Mexica, they had a whole city that was environmentally sustainable, were, a very powerful empire throughout the region, had a whole bunch of science and stuff that they had relied on, and like whole traditions of literature and philosophy. They by no means were like an ignorant group of people. So I think that my own wrestle with trying to make that make sense within my own like little modern head was what ended up drawing me to being like, I have to explore all of these poems more. A second piece of that is that, especially in US Latino culture, there's this romanticization that happens of the Aztecs. And that happens in a bit in a reactionary way, is because in a lot of sometimes Anglo spaces, there's this tendency to just portray the Aztecs as savages because they did do human sacrifice, right? And that's just something I think for most cultures around the world is kind of hard to wrap your mind around, and also to stomach. One of the For me, this isn't funny, but I laughed. One of the moments in like Broken Spears that just stunned me the most is like, Cortez and his group of people are kind of traveling towards Tecnotitlan, and the Aztecs caught wind of this, and they're like, okay, we know they've been going around conquering other people. These aren't just your average people who are coming here. Let's go ahead and meet them and, do a ceremony, welcome them respectfully as like people who are potentially equals, and then start a dialogue. And one of the things they do to try to show how like respect is sacrifice a human being in front of like these like conquistadors, essentially. And of course the like white people are just horrified. They're like, oh my god, you're just slicing into a human like in front of me. And this was supposed to be like an act of respect. I forgot why I was telling the story. Others like it was something that had moved and shocked and stunned me. Oh, this is why I'm telling the story. So there's this tendency in Anglo culture to view like Aztecs as like these savages for part of those reasons, like a human sacrifice. And then there's this reaction from like a lot of Chicano communities to romanticize the Aztecs, partially because a lot of Native and Latino communities have been gutted like culturally and had been so like racially demeaned that like the desire to reclaim an Aztec heritage is really understandable because they were very like technologically robust and like wise people. But at the same time, the part of the reason the conquistadores were able to conquer at that time was because other native groups were just pissed at the Aztecs for being imperial and, you know, doing human sacrifices and things like that. So part of it was my desire to want to kind of poke at some of the romanticization I had grown up with of the Aztecs, as well as like, yes, you know, try to approach it in a human way with while being critical and not just like blindly romanticizing a group. Sorry, there's so many cans of worms I just opened there. So like go down any path you want, but
It's beautiful. It's just, I love it. So I love to see where like one little thing can kind of inspire you to kind of travel down a lot of different roads. That happens to me a lot of the time when I'm just inspired by one little thing, and then it just branches my, I don't know, deep dive, my want to know exactly how to conquer something and finish something. So I love that you got inspired by this book and about this idea. Walk me through, there's 8 different omens. So, and I hate to, poetry is in nature just very it's very secular. It's like it's something we embrace internally, and we all have kind of a different perspective of. And it's like it's this emotional connection that we have with the words, and whatever the poet is trying to do. So it's hard to, in this kind of setting, ask you exactly what do you mean by this, because I want people to kind of experience this for themselves. But I do want to go over each of the omens, if that's okay.
yeah. So you mean the poems or like historically what they're doing?
Well, I want to talk about your stuff.
Okay.
I want to talk about your stuff. I mean, we can tell me where your brain kind of went down in this tunnel of thought with each different omen and what you wanted to bring out in them. How about that?
Yeah. So one broad kind of overarching thing I was thinking about while these poems are being collected and written is thinking about, for me it was powerful that like, oh, there was omens before, you know, Cortez and some of these folks even arrived. So for me, part of what I was doing as a poet was also thinking about like, yes, contemporary like United States, and thinking about, yes, how different how these different like things also speak to each other, right? And that kind of happens throughout a number of these poems, where like, you know, the speaker of the first poem uses a phrase like crooked Christ, where like, you know, there's obviously a speaker who is I'm imagining as being a sort of like Aztec warrior, but also having like all of the history that we have experienced from, you know, those days into now within their repertoire that they're able to speak from and to. So to a certain extent, I was imagining that throughout different parts of these poems, where I'm imagining aspects of them be also speaking to today's like you know, situation we are with the US, which I view as being, you know, an imperial nation that is also on decline, in much the way that like the Aztec Empire was at the same time at the time. I think after that, it was a matter of looking at these omens individually and then kind of deciding what angle to go from. I love the idea of exploring the first one through the perspective of the dead warriors and just kind of how they were interpreting the pillars of fire. The second one, I choose to speak from the perspective of the fire that was burning the temple of Huitzilipotli, who is represented by hummingbirds. Um, the third one I was imagining is the perspective of just like common people with like, another temple has burned, and like, where does that leave us? And there was a conversation happening between Christianity and these omens, in the sense that like, you know, in the flood one, I'm like crossing out different scriptures of Noah's Ark where like it's very tempting to want to read some of these omens with like a Christian lens, at least for me, because I grew up so heavily like entrenched in like Christian literature and things like that. So part of what I was doing was batting some of that stuff away and then trying to use imagery to talk about some of the stuff that was happening in Aztec society at the time, and then also just work through my own like crap. So like I'm specifically thinking about like the poem where a possessed prophet prays for the worshippers of false gods as three comets tear through the sky. I wrote this one while I was just dealing with like one of the worst breakups of my life. So like part of what I was also channeling was just like grief I had within me and like trying to make sense of a world after your own world has kind of collapsed in, right? Which might not be the most historically sophisticated way to approach something, but it was very much just using what I was working through at the time to be like, okay, where would this position like a different human that was experiencing something else? I feel like speaking broadly, that's what I can point to. And I'm willing to like go down any path you want me to.
Cool. All right. Do you want me to bring up if I share my screen and bring up so that we can just see a visual of some of these poems, because I do like how they are presented. So let me see if I can find it. That is not. Hold on. I just need to show all windows, and there it is. Okay. Okay. Can you see this? All right. So here is what I have. So let's talk about the first one where you're specifically saying that you wanted to focus on the dead warriors, correct? Walk me through, like, I like how the package is. So just tell me, are these like the voices on the sides here, are those also some of the dead speaking out?
Yeah, I see those as the dead speaking out and some of them being communal voices. I'm looking at a few of them and like one of the things I am applying to this poem in particular. There's two things I want to mention. One is if you go to the right side, the second one in the middle, it was like a flaming ear of corn, a fiery signal, ablaze at daybreak. This one I want to say is verbatim of basically what the native folks were saying. At least the Mexica was like, this is just taken verbatim from the Broken Spears, or at least the way it was translated by my memory. There might be like a word or two I messed with in there, or a phrase or things I combined, but that's essentially part of what the native folks were saying. If you go to the one above that, we built our nation where a god of war and sun took us, a land where the eagle took the serpent writhing in its beak and broke its back, a land where our men were the eagles and everyone else writhing. Um, what I expect people to see from there is the image that's on the Mexican flag, which is the origin story of Tenochtitlan, what is now Mexico City, which is a city that the Cortez and his people conquered. Part of how Gloria Anzaldúa, the author of Borderlands, a lesbian Chicana scholar that's super monumental, at least in Latinx studies, part of how she interprets this is that the serpent is a feminine image and the eagle is a masculine image, where like those are the metaphors those are playing with. So part of how Gloria is interpreting this origin story and what happened to Mexica culture is also like a domination of patriarchy over the feminine. And that's something that is kind of played with throughout these texts. And I think there's particularly a line in the flood poem that brings up that serpent imagery again. To speak about an act of violence that would happen to homosexual men in Aztec society. But in any case, I wanted to point to those just to kind of point to like things that are kind of contextually happening there. The rest of these I'm imagining as like yes, different viewpoints that folks have. I see like here, we knew that they were brutes when they first saw our temples and grew nervous by its glory, its gold, its bloodthirsty gold. Where like the Mexica were especially conscious of like, yes, how greedy like the conquistadores were coming in, right? The one underneath it, before we couldn't recognize their language, their signs, but now we see them everywhere. Their badges, their all-seeing eyes, even their spangled stars. Spangled, of course, being such an American word there, right? And especially with this one being an astronomical kind of event where there's looking up to the sky and then seeing these like kind of pillars of fire that remained there and kind of freaked them out. That one seemed like an appropriate one that would like pull things into the future. One of the things that was interesting to me with this fire being described as a pyramid is that there is the image of the like pyramid and the dollar bill. So you get like a little bit of Illuminati references like in this poem and like conspiracy theory sort of stuff going on. Which is more just like fun and playful. But also speaking to kind of the domination that would eventually happen of the United States over large swaths of Latin America and especially Mexico. So I was kind of using this perspective of what is essentially like a kind of cocky, toxic, masculine, like Aztec warriors speaking from their own, like, positionality of like what was lost and what they had experienced, but also poking at like the domination and like from the perspective of somebody who is oppressed, right? One of the things that was important for me to preserve in this poem was like the toxicity within that, is because especially as a Central American Latinx person, um we come into this romanticization as the Aztecs with like a different perspective, right? Like you speak to a lot of Central American native groups, and they were the ones who historically were involved in the flower wars, where the Aztecs would essentially send warriors to just gather up human sacrifices and regularly would just like, pillage villages to get their human sacrifices. And there was a lot of resentment built up kind of in there between some of these native groups. So that was something I kind of wanted to preserve as like part of the perspective. I didn't want it to be one that was romanticized, but one that was spoke more honestly about like some of the stuff that they were about.
Wow. Perfect.
That's what I was
Thank you.
trying to do. Whether it successfully does that is a completely different story.
No, I mean, you can see the echoes of the people that that you are, I don't know, conveying there in the sheet, in that page. But I wanted to know from my specific where they came from and who was speaking. So I think that you answered that pretty well.
There's definitely like a multiplicity of voices, which for me I feel like was my way of trying to navigate the complexity of the narrative, right? Like the risk in like doing a series like this is just like, oh, you might flatten something or make it seem like there's only one truth, when really it's much more complicated than that, especially when it comes to the story of the conquest, where it's so mythologized at this point, where there's this sort of like theatrics happening around it, and discovering what actually happened or uncovering what actually happened is a very complicated thing to try to do, just because the narratives around it are so politicized, right? Whether it was by like, the disenfranchised Aztecs of the day who were like bitter and angry at their leaders for like such a monumental screw up, right? Like, how do you go from being like one of the largest empires and so powerful to being completely mowed over by like different native groups who used to be your subjects, and then like a small group of white people, like they were infuriated and like bitter about it for obvious reasons, which also paints the way they looked at their leaders, where a lot of the disenfranchised Mexica, the Aztecs, were some of the people who were most bitter and unfair to Moctezuma. And we're like, he was an idiot, he screwed up so bad. Where I imagine a lot of us would find the position he was in very challenging, to just like, what do you do with this new group of like people who are coming through, and how do you negotiate when there's so much mystery and stuff you're unaware of.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. That whole culture is very fascinating to me. I've always been fascinated by it, but I don't really know very much about it.
Yeah, and I feel like this was just for me, the series was important just because it's a window into just like one fascinating aspect of it where it's like, whoa, there was 8 whole omens, y'all. Like
Well, and
that's
it's
just like
teaching
one
me.
window into like searching out more and just the
Mhm.
complexity of the narrative.
Well, and that's what I think that your work is really doing well, is that it's teaching me exactly more about these specific people and kind of where they were and what was happening. And it's kind of it's a beautiful yet haunting portrayal of what's going on to these people. I wanted to talk. Well, I'm going to share the screen again and open up another one that I wanted to talk about. Let's see. Okay. Sorry. I wish I was better at this. Okay. So, I mean, I wanted to just show this one because you talked about the flame specifically, but it 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 weaves like a flame in the text. So it's almost like I can see it and I can breathe it as I'm reading through it. And I loved that. This is the one that really struck me because it brought a lot more of humanity to it. I could, and it's beautifully put together, as in you use a lot of really good language, very good, just like the alliteration is really engaging, and I like the way it's just kind of put together so that I feel like I'm falling with the tempo all the way down. Can you talk about this one specifically?
Yeah, part of the reason the stanzas like the tercets are going kind of in the staircase sort of way. Partially is just for me when I look at it, I almost get like a little dizzy and I imagining like the word woozy is in that second line, and I kind of imagine that after suffering such a like devastating loss where like something that's very culturally meaningful, like imagine if like the Salt Lake City temple burned down, right? Like that would be such a like mind-boggling traumatic thing to happen to the people of Utah. And I think even people who aren't like faithful members of the Mormon church would be quite like, I dare say traumatized by like that sort of event. And like that's kind of like what I was imagining attempting to capture is just like that sense of loss there. Also one of the most violent things that happened with the um Cortez and like the Spanish slowly conquering Latin America, replacing worldviews, is that like the cosmovision, as they call it in a lot of Latin American studies, or like the worldview of native folks was being so utterly dismantled and rendered irrelevant or denigrated and things like that, where like anybody who has lost faith that they were deeply committed to knows just how like soul wrecking that is. And I feel like those were the things that I was trying to capture, of course, through like imagery and the tools of poetry. Myself always being like obsessed with like song and rhythm, and especially when it comes to grief, that's one of the times where, at least in my poetry, I lean most heavily on alliteration and song, is when partially because it's a comforting um frame in which to hold something. Like one of the things I love about poetry is that you can give some like horrific grief a form, and it would make it easier to hold in that way because you can hold it, where otherwise the grief would just kind of overwhelm you and like just be, you'd be unable to swim in it. There's ways of capturing pieces of it and like compartmentalizing them and being like, yes, this is this grief, and yes, the fact I can hold it makes it more possible to reckon with. um so I feel like that's what I have to say about this one. As far as like more context, part of it was just looking at like the imagery of like different temples and stuff they use and stuff like that, and just kind of riffing off of it. But this one was mostly processing just grief on my end.
Beautiful. That is beautiful. Um, this one, 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 um this one was a little hard for me to grasp.
Yeah, and this one's the one that's been most brutalized on the page, honestly. So one thing I should say is about this period of my work is I'm in MFA mode, and part of what happened when that happened is that I was like, okay, all of these poems were initially written horizontally. So this is like me adapting it to your vertical traditional page, just
Gotcha.
because nobody wanted to publish like a poem that was horizontally written that way. Like, because whether you're printing it or putting it on the web, people are like, that takes math and like formatting challenges. So that was me wrestling with that one. I would say this one's also definitely the most unhinged one, whereas why I'm just like, okay, there's this possessed prophet, which I invent, that's just kind of serving as like an interpreter for some of the wild things that are happening. The
Mhm.
imagery that happens in this one is essentially like three comets that just kind of burn through the sky that people get freaked out by. So what questions or what were you being like, wow, that's weird or doesn't make sense?
Well, I format is really important to me. So when I'm looking at the specific way, I mean, you keep recurring the I hope, you never know, I you hope, and as that goes, but there are specific things that are capitalized. So when I'm my eyes gravitate to the capitalization of them. So now I'm getting more of just a story of the sun, his light, the sky, and on like that. So it's almost like I'm getting two different poems. Does that make sense? So that I'm getting
Where are
two
the two
different.
poems then? Which is the first poem and which would be the second that you're seeing?
Well, I'm seeing the reoccurring, the I hope you never know type when I'm just reading it through. That is the feeling that I'm getting.
Mhm.
Is this horrific event that has kind of fractured a society. But when I see the other poem, like just the highlighted parts, I'm seeing more of a beautiful sky display. Nothing to really be afraid of. Is that making
Yeah,
sense?
that's a perfect way of breaking it down. And I feel like that very much matches what a lot of people have told me about this poem, where this poem I feel like was one that like disturbed people when I brought it like to workshop. And part of the reason is because it says things. I'm gonna pull it up on my screen just so I can go to specific lines. But it like says things like, I hope you never lose never learn your history, never learn hope, never learn. Where especially like I hope you never like learn your history. Like there was a line like that where people like honed in on, where they're like, whoa, like, that's like a huge violence that is being done to like take people's history from them. There's also this way that like the sun, I like the way you described it, where it's like almost like the sun is so frequently, well, like for obvious reasons, like a good thing, right? Like, I think the sun, as far as human beings are concerned, net positive. Like, life wouldn't exist without it.
Mhm.
One of the pieces of context, at least with the way I was thinking of it, is that the primary god for the Aztecs was Huitzilopochtli, which was a sun god, right? Part of that cosmovision was how human sacrifices and stuff like that were being justified. So for me, I feel like the seduction and like this view of it being beautiful and something desirable is especially what I was trying to get across, because like at the time especially I was just wrestling with like just masculinity and what it was and what it meant. And I feel like masculinity, or at least male privilege, being something that for many men, as any form of privileges, is deeply seductive, right? I think there's certain scholars who would call it a gender bribe. And they'd call whiteness a racial bribe, right? Like you get to tell men that they are better than other human beings because they are men, and that they get these certain privileges attached to it, and they deserve that because they are men. And that's like something you can say about whiteness too, right? And it is something that's like very alluring. I think that this one and the first poem kind of speak to that. And for me, it was this attempt to kind of wrestle with like the alluringness of it, and also trying to be honest about like some of the violence that it causes. Whether I did that successfully or not, of course, is a completely different story, right? You're getting the poems in Willy's head versus like what ended up on the page. I think for me, part of the reason I drew from like the possessed prophet perspective is just because it let it be a little mad, right? Like if I failed in conveying what I was just saying, but they were glimmers of it, I could be like, the prophet's kind of, a lunatic. He's not a reliable narrator, failure, and for I what I hope at least happens for like readers is that tension between like, wow, there's seems to be like a very intense loss happening in line with like some like I think one of the weirdest things about this poem is that to a certain extent it's a diss track to sun and light, these necessary things for life. I hope you never give up your darkness for light, just being like this line that a lot of people were like, ugh, like I don't know if I trust somebody who says that to me, right? And for whatever reason this speaker is using that language to try to claim safety. Like I don't think the speaker feels safe or knows what safety even looks like anymore.
Okay. That's
For whatever that's worth.
no, that's love. I like hearing your interpretation for it, and what you were trying to convey. As I said, poetry is it's personal. It's nice to know exactly what the poet was trying to convey, but it's also speaks to the specifics to me and what I engage in it, so I think in that way it's very successful, as it gives the right feeling that you're going for. So but I thought that one was very interesting. I'm going to go, because of where we are in time, I'm going to go to the last one, if that's okay.
Yeah, this one's fun. I love this.
Okay. So get that. Here we go. So yeah, let's talk about this one. First, how do you say that name?
The way I pronounce it is Tlacanzoli. You would have to ask like a Nahua scholar for the, precise pronunciation that contemporary Native folks and then presumably 400 years ago Native folks would have used for it.
Okay. Well, it's not that, I mean, I read it correctly in my brain, but when I speak it, it sounds like mush. So,
Fair, it's
all
a
right.
completely foreign language.
Right. All right. So talk to me about the specific characterization you were doing with this one, because it's your end cap of the collection. It's the last Omen. Let's just talk about this one.
I feel like thesis wise, part of what is happening with this poem is kind of describing how the violence of the warfare that would happen when the conquistadores and the natives met, and the like ensuing tension would create these kind of zombie creatures where you would have different limbs grafted onto different bodies, and that kind of speaks to what would happen in the future with the creation of like mestizos. Mestizaje is a very complicated racial construct in Latin America. Essentially, what it is this idea that Latin Americans, what unifies them as a nation is their mixed race heritage, where they have, are pulling primarily from European, Spanish heritage, as well as native indigenous heritage. And then, contemporary reformations of this would also make room for the African and Asian ancestry that also is woven into Latin America. The way it is in the poem, I'd say is more contemporary to how Chicanos and perhaps contemporary or like mid 20th century Latin Americans were interpreting mestizaje, where they saw it as primarily an empowering racial construct and metaphor to latch onto to understand who we are. Like at the end of this, there's very much this kind of there's this attempt to convey power, where these Tlacanzoli like are reveling in the power that they have and causing fear to the native folks who are, you know, there in Mexico at the time, the Mexica. I think one important thing to say about this, well, there's a lot of different important things to say about this. I'm juggling a few things in my head right now.
Yeah.
One is that like especially mid-century like feminist movement in Mexico would have been interpreting mestizaje as this powerful thing is because um there's I'm forgetting her name. Oh my gosh, the native woman who helped serve as a translator for Cortez. Oh my god, this is so embarrassing. La Malinche, there we go. La Malinche. There's this character in Latin American history, La Malinche, who's been horrifically and misogynistically portrayed, often as a traitor and as a whore to the Spanish, for serving as a translator to Cortez. What a lot of mid-century Mexican feminist movements were doing were reclaiming her image and talking about it as a choice to become a mestiza, where it was like, no, it was a rejection of the Aztec and also a rejection of the Spanish in an attempt to create something new. Some of the challenges to using this metaphor historically has been twofold. One is that well, it's mostly onefold. Well, it's basically like mestizaje has been used, and especially in its original conception by Jose Vasconcelos, was a racist white supremacist concept that was like, you know, this is the way we civilize the natives is by intermarrying, and that's what will make this stronger race of people, this raza cósmica, that they would brag about. And a huge part of it was denying native peoples the ability to retain onto their tradition. It also is, of course, like all racial constructs, kind of a myth where, you know, you can say about, you know, there's very many parts of the world where you just look at it and you're like, yeah, mostly a mixed race people, because like that's what happens when you like, you know, get people from different histories and regions of the world together. But one of the facts of Latin America is that what you see in a lot of communities is, you know, there's these pockets of native folks who have managed to maintain to their traditions, and there's also decolonized native or colonized natives who have lost their traditions, but really are racially, at least like genetically still, you know, I'm not going to get into the biology of it, but at least like the region their people are coming from, all native. So which is just a way of saying that like that mestizaje, what that means is creating a mixed race people, like that's also a myth kind of there, which gets complicated. What this poem is just trying to do is be like, look at how badass these zombies are, and use that as a metaphor for like mestizo identity.
I didn't when I first read this one specifically, I didn't quite understand it, and I think that's a lot because I didn't know the history of it. It just, there was a lot of like frightening creatures and things.
Yeah, it's frightening. They're zombies.
Like, and I think that's really fascinating. I like the culture that is ingrained into this piece, and the thought behind all the things that you're trying to convey to the reader, and that is really appreciated, especially like within these. I mean, I'm just trying to, yeah, there's a lot of really beautiful things you state, but it's also very horrifying. Can I just say a couple of
Oh, it is. I feel like, yeah, all of these are omens. Like all of these are like deeply upsetting, horrifying kind of
Yeah.
things. I think one of the things I try to do as like a writer is try to, part of the reason I feel like poets couch things in part of such like attempts at beautiful language is just so that you can talk about some of these horrifying things, right? Like there's hopefully, if the violence is something that makes something more difficult, part of the reason poets add beautiful language to that is to make it more bearable just to get through. There's a lot of ethical complications, of course, in that with like beautifying horrific acts, but that's just a can of worms I'll open and put to the side.
No, that helps me. I mean, at least it is graphic, but it's not like it's one thing that if you just show blood and expect a reaction, but it's also another thing where you kind of craft a suspense, and that's just really good storytelling in itself. So, and in that way, I can totally get it. I totally see what you're trying to achieve. But I really like the last one is just I mean, did it achieve the capture of the entire piece that you were going for all the omens?
Yeah, to a certain extent, it's the one that made most sense for me. One, I'm dealing with also, yes, like real material. So like I can't rearrange these omens if I felt like one of them would serve as a capstone to the piece. For me, the reason I felt like lucky that they came in an order where the one that was a metaphor for mestizaje, I guess, happened to be at the end, where it's like, yeah, that's the logical conclusion of these omens. Like, the Aztec Empire collapses and a new racial and world order kind of commences because of it. So in that sense, for me, it fits as a capstone and makes sense that way. But I feel like very much these poems, because they're coming at things from different perspectives and stuff like that, they can feel, at least to me, a little bit cluttery. Like this just concept by itself is something that can easily just be stretched into a book or so if I wanted to. Which now I'm thinking about, but for like the time being was just very much like, no, this is a series. The way it's existing now is I have this second collection of poetry I'm working on called Mercury and Reggaeton, which plays with like astrology, just because like Mercury and Reggaeton is just a funny phrase. Yes, because Mercury in retrograde. And then they're like a set of poems that's very hip hop and reggaeton influence, but are also dealing with catastrophe. And for me, just one of the things about horrible things, whether it's a breakup or a political disaster, is that it has this way of making your life just feel deterministic, almost like I'm a slave to the stars. Like, I'm out of control in my life. And that's something where right now, where these poems are living, at least in my own like attempts of putting books out, is like in the center of a collection that's ultimately about like heartbreak and political disaster that engages reggaeton and astrology, like, to a certain extent. But now this conversation is making me be like, oh yeah, there's other ways that this can exist depending on what work I wanted to do with it. Yeah. It's definitely something that has a lot of kind of ins and outs and tangles in it that would be worth exploring. Whether I'm the person that does it or not, it's a different question, but yeah.
But I hope you do, because I like what you've done so far, and I really like the way you frame language. Your wordplay is really refreshing and very clean, and it's specifically emotional, so that I feel the terror, I feel the where these people are. I feel almost like the ghosts of these people. So, and that is a great craft. It's very cool gift when it comes to storytelling. So take that. I hope that you actually, something like this would be something I'd totally read. So
Thank you.
just start thinking about that. But so now we've kind of covered all those things. What would be a good resource for people if they wanted to read more about the omens? You're saying that they're real things. So you were inspired by a book. What was that book?
The book is Broken Spears by Miguel Leon Portilla. I'll put Miguel Leon Portilla's name in the chat. He's a
Yes.
very interesting, monumental scholar when it comes to especially like native literature in Latin America. So essentially, part of the reason this book made such a huge impact when it was published, I want to say in the 1950s or 60s in Latin America, was because nobody had done what he had done before, which was edited all the native narratives, put them in one collection and said, let's look at this instead. Usually what people relied on were European perspectives on stuff. And it's not to say that this book isn't European perspectives, because a lot of the stuff that has survived from this time period are like friars going through and recording the oral history of folks and asking native informants about this stuff. Part of the challenges there is that it's being filtered through somebody who is trying to convert somebody and also take their culture away from them. And that's something that a lot of Latin American studies makes very big kind of points to a lot of being like, you can't, these aren't reliable narrators either. The other thing that's important to keep in mind with a lot of these narratives is that the native folks frequently, especially when they were talking about like their religious practices and stuff like that, like the folks who were being interviewed were essentially like the accountant or the secretary, where they're like, yeah, I can tell you what I know, but the priests were the ones holding this narrative, and you murdered them and you burned a library. So like, I can tell you the knowledge I have, but it's not like the bona fide knowledge that like you would be hoping for. There's also the fact that the priests would, manipulate things to make them fit more within Christianity, and also to be able to reflect back the culture to native folks differently to make them easier to convert. And also just the fact that like, you were translating a whole culture, and that's very difficult to do, especially when there wasn't a shared heritage or understanding. One of my favorite examples about this is I was reading a work about Nawa sexuality called The Flower and the Scorpion. That one of the first things they do is like, first of all, sexuality, like the way it's understood in the Western world, wasn't a concept to these native folks. Like these acts would happen, but like it wasn't understood under the umbrella of sexuality, which by itself is kind of like mind-boggling of like, okay, that's the only framework I had to understand certain acts. So like, what do I do with that? The second piece of it is that native folks didn't have a word for trash or sin, which is really important if you're a priest. So there was certain acts where the priest would be like, oh, so a sin, and then a native person would be like, well, we don't really have that concept, but I guess like there's room for misinterpretation and mistranslation there. I would point to Broken Spears, Miguel Lian Portilla, also The Flower and the Scorpion, which I'm pretty sure if you Google that and Nawa sexuality, you'll get that book. I'll add sexuality to that. And then there's one more text that I definitely wanted to point people to. Let me pull it up in my research library real quick.
Okay.
It might be this one, but let me double check. Montezuma. Sorry, I did a whole like research project on this when I was doing my Latin American studies degree because I got obsessed. So there was one source in particular that I was like, oh, this one was so good. I'm pretty sure it's this book, The Death of Tecnoctitlan by Mundi. Because it has a whole chapter on it that covers the omens. Yeah, I can send this on later once I have the actual chapter, because she does a very good deep dive into like what these omens meant for the time period and the different perspectives on them. Especially since like the Christian narrators also believed in a supernatural worldview. So when the natives told them the stuff, they're like, oh yeah, that probably happened. Like, all of that. They could feed off of each other in that way. I feel like that's the starting point, right? Like, I'm also not a scholar of this stuff. I'm kind of just a grad student who like dug their nose in it and then kind of emerged and then ran out of academia screaming. So that's what you're getting from me.
Well, those are the best kinds though. We're kind of like, it's like fan fiction almost, we're kind of fanning what scholars actually did, so we only need to know specifics, just little things that we kind of, we gravitate to. It doesn't need to be something that might ruin our fandom for that. So
yeah, that tension between the history and the creativity is definitely real.
Yeah. Well, awesome. This has been a really great chat. I've hoped that you've had fun. I will upload this to our YouTube channel, and I'll put all those links, especially where you can the different the different books that you have listed. We'll put those on there, and we will put your website so people can check you out. Do you have any place, like anything that's coming up that you wanted to kind of highlight?
Honestly, not right now. The first book will be coming March 2023 or April 2023, but like, that's far enough away that I don't even got a link for that yet. So, you can follow me on Palomo Poemas. I can put that on Instagram. Or yes, if you wanted to keep track of work, and like when I'm about to publish things and stuff like that. I also do speed little book reviews there. I've been since I took on the Utah Humanities Book Festival job, my reading used to be very much more focused where like, in the MFA, I spent like 3 years almost exclusively reading like poetry and then Latin American stuff. But the role I have now is like, oh, I'm like diving into children's books and like weird nonfiction books that I never would have picked up before. So there's kind of a weird posh of things there. But in general, there's actually a lot of projects that I've just been sitting on and waiting for like release stuff to have happen. But like the way to follow it, if you're actually curious, is just following me on social media, because once they arrive and are ready, we'll publish them through there. Some of the stuff that's kind of in the works are the set of translations I have of Salvadoran short stories that are going to be published by Piscucha magazine, which is this project I have going on with Alexandra Regalado, who lives in El Salvador, Florida. So there'll be like a good body of work if you're interested in Central American literature right now. There's a few tracks that we're getting mixed that are a mix of hip hop and reggaeton that are going to be released where I rap on some point next year. There's like a bunch of weird stuff artistically that I'm involved in. So if you want to get chances to see me perform around Utah or things like that, that's the place to generally follow. And then, when stars align, they'll align. But yeah, that's generally what I've been up to. Nothing gigantic in the foreseeable couple of months.
But we'll definitely follow you when your book comes out, because that's something that the League is very supportive of. So we'll definitely keep you up. So thank you, Willy, so much for joining us for this. And I think that we're good. So thank you so much. I'm gonna
Ciao.